좋은 기회로 캘리포니아 포모나에 위치한 이스트만 본사를 방문할 수 있게 되어 제가 사용하는 악기에 대해서 더 자세히 알 수 있는 계기가 되었는데요. 그리고 새로 출시된 악기도 테스트해 볼 수 있는 기회를 가질 수 있었어요. 자, 그럼 여러분들께 이스트만에 대해 알려드리고자 해요. 한국에서는 아직 생소한 색소폰 브랜드인 이스트만, 라이언 리치맨 부사장님과 대화를 나누면서 악기의 디자인이 어떻게 소리에 영향을 주는지에 대해서 이해할 수 있었고, 또 이스트만이 추구하는 사운드를 만들기 위해서 어떤 디자인적 요소와 노력이 반영되었는지 알 수 있었던 소중한 시간이었습니다. 이스트만은 금관악기 제작의 대표 기업 샤이어와 목관악기 제작의 대표 기업 헤인즈를 인수하여 두 기업의 뛰어난 기술력과 오래된 노하우를 바탕으로 색소폰을 제작한다고 합니다. 마치 애플 회사의 아이폰처럼 이스트만 역시 미국 본사에서 디자인과 설계를 하고 엄격한 품질 관리 하에 중국에 설립한 자체 공장에서 색소폰이 생산된다고 합니다. 이스트만 색소폰은 많은 아티스트들의 사랑을 받고 있으며 그들 중 세계적인 색소포니스트 반민저는 악기가 매우 편안하며 잘 조율되어 있고 손의 포지션이 편하며 과거의 빈티지한 셀머 색소폰을 연주할 때보다 더 크고 진동감 있는 굵은 사운드를 낸다며 극찬을 하기도 하였습니다. 이번 영상 자료를 찾다가 들어가 본 이스트만 인스타그램에 제가 본사를 방문했던 그날이 기록되어 있네요. 초급자부터 세계적인 색소폰 아티스트들을 위한 색소폰까지 다양한 악기 라인업이 있는데요. 그중 이스트만의 세 가지 대표 모델에 대해 알아볼게요. 먼저 52nd Street EST652 모델은 재즈가 성행하던 미국 뉴욕 52번가에 영감을 얻어 제작되었다고 하는데요. 클래식한 미국식 색소폰의 디자인적 특징을 반영하였고 과거 미국에서 색소폰이 연주되었을 때의 사운드를 모티브하여 화려하면서도 아름답고 멋진 사운드의 성향이 있도록 만들어졌다고 합니다. 다음 루 세인 조지 EST650 모델은 색소폰 발명가인 아돌프 sak스의 색소폰 공장이 있었던 프랑스 파리 세인트 조지 스트리트에 영감을 얻어 제작되었다고 하는데요. 클래식한 프랑스식 색소폰의 디자인적 특징을 반영하였고 과거 프랑스에서 색소폰이 연주되었을 때의 사운드를 모티브하여 좀 더 또렷하고 중앙 중심적인 사운드의 성향이 있도록 만들었다고 합니다. 그리고 이 중 최상위 모델 루 세인 조지는 650 모델의 바디에 특허를 받은 데이비드 슈파님이 DS 메커니즘과 실버 플레이팅 키로 터치감을 좋게 만들었다고 합니다. 그리고 무엇보다 특이한 점은 두 가지 스타일의 넥을 제공하여 마치 성향이 다른 두 개의 악기를 연주할 수 있도록 하였다고 하는데요. 자, 그럼 여러분들과 함께 라이언 리치맨 부사장님과의 인터뷰 현장으로 가볼게요. Selma Action 2 for alto saxophone in Korea. And the fingering feels like a Selma.
I used to have a series 2 as well, and yes, this should feel very familiar to players that play a Selmer or a Yamaha or Yanagasawa, those kinds of instruments.
So do you play saxophone?
I do.
Oh, great.
I do. Yep. I'm a saxophonist of sorts.
Wow.
Is there any reason why those toys? Is it more cosmetic things or is it
Nope. All for sound. Yep.
For sound?
Yeah, whenever you add mass, you're going to add a difference in resistance and a difference in tonality. And so if you add ringed tone holes or a rolled style tone hole is kind of what we call it, it's going to feel different for one thing because you've got more surface area for that pad to be touching on. So it should feel very different as far as the playing, even though the keys are identical between these two models. It's just going to have a different feel because of the increased surface area. It's also going to have a different tonal quality because you're adding mass to every tone hole. So that's what gives it its breadth of sound. I don't normally classify the saxophones as a jazz saxophone or a classical saxophone. We don't distinguish them that way. And one of the reasons I want to make sure that we don't classify them that way is, in my opinion, one of the fathers of classical saxophone in America was a guy named Cecil Leeson. And Cecil played on a Martin saxophone, an American saxophone. And it had some of the features that we have on our 52nd Street because it's it's fashioned after a classic American saxophone. And he was a classical saxophonist playing on a Martin. And then we've got lots of jazz artists that play on Mark VIs, right? So even though there's different styles of instrument and different ways to play them, different tonalities, we don't say specifically one is jazz, one is classical. So even though we kind of name them, 52nd Street was like a hub for jazz, and Rue Saint George in Paris was where Adolphe Sax had his factory. So we kind of name them that way to show you kind of the way they lean, but we don't actually come out and say, this is for this or this is for that. Classic French-made instruments rather than classic American-made instruments. So you're going to see different bell size, you're going to see different materials used, you're going to see a different taper in the neck, you're going to see different tone hole design, same intonation, like the tone holes are in the same spot, the geometry of the saxophone is identical between the 650 and the 652 with those subtle differences, like a 652, a 52nd Street that has rolled tone holes. A Rue St. George has straight tone holes. A 52nd Street has a larger bell. Rue St. George has a more standard bell. A 52nd Street has no lacquer on it. A Rue St. George has a beautiful clear lacquer on it. It has a floral engraving, like classic French instruments. There was floral engraving on classic American instruments too, but a lot of those had like Art Deco designs and some other interesting things. So you'll find different engraving on the 52nd Street, and that has nothing to do with sound, but it's more like inspired by those two different types of instrument. The 52nd Street has a different neck taper to give it more breadth, more brilliance, so to speak. The Rue St. George has a slightly narrower neck taper, and it gives us more focus and more center, more core. And so, and less flexibility, and more flexibility on the 52nd Street. So different styles of instrument, really. And it helps give our customers kind of two voices to choose from, so to speak.
여기서 제게 아주 흥미롭게 다가온 부분은 넥의 중요성을 강조하고 최상위 모델에서 두 가지 타입의 넥을 제공하는 것이었습니다. 악기 브랜드마다 추구하는 성향이 있고 그 성향을 완성시키기 위해 각자 그들만의 기술력이 담긴 디자인적 요소를 적용할 텐데요. 하지만 다른 제조사들은 강조하지 않던 넥 부분에 이스트만이 집중하고 있다는 점이 매우 궁금해졌습니다.
You can't really see the difference in the taper, but once you play them, you can certainly feel the difference. Correct. Think street and Rue, right? So the Rue St. George comes standard with an R taper. The 52nd Street comes standard with an S taper. I was talking with a saxophone player here in Los Angeles, and he says, the more that I mess around with other things and saxophones and mouthpieces and necks, he's like, I'm coming to believe we mostly play on necks. The saxophone is like, fine, but if you have a great neck, that's where the sound comes from. And it really makes sense because if you think about, let's take flute players, right? They'll spend a lot of money just on a head joint. And they'll play their flute body for a while, but when they can upgrade the head joint, that's where all the sound, it's a very important part of the instrument. And same thing on the saxophone, the mouthpiece, reed, ligature, and neck, like that beginning of the instrument, that's where most of your sound is generated anyway. So if you get a mouthpiece that matches up well to a neck and you find the right reed combination, and so there's a lot there. And in our experimentation, we've just discovered a few different neck tapers that give us those different sounds. That you say that this one sounds more like your horn. It's supposed to. Like that was the goal, is to be able to have a saxophone that just by putting on a different neck, you can have a very different sound for your jazz gigs or for your small combo gigs or whatever sound you're going for. And then if you need to play a piece of classical music, you could put on your classical mouthpiece, put on your R neck, and have a very clear, focused, centered classical sound. So it helps you get two instruments in one. This saxophone right here, this is our flagship saxophone. This I would put up against anything in the world of any price, And so if you're talking about a brass saxophone that's lacquered or unlacquered of any manufacturer, I would put our Rue St. George up against all of them. Now, if you're talking about a sterling silver saxophone, that's a different sound automatically. So as long as we're talking apples to apples, I would put this horn up against all of the competition as far as playability, intonation, tonality, sound quality, all of those things that we look for as saxophonists and musicians. I think that this is in the running. And a lot of artists believe that too. So that's what we're going for. I'm not saying that this is good for being made in China. I'm saying this is good in the competition. You look at our other competitions and they could be made in Taiwan. Like we used to have our saxophones made for us there. You look at saxophones coming from Japan. You look at saxophones coming from France. You look at saxophones coming from, well, not America anymore, but you look at other countries that are producing saxophones and pretty much it's Germany, it's France, and it's Japan that are making the highest level saxophones. And I think our goal is to be on par with them. And I think we've achieved that.
아마 취미생분들 중에는 악기의 미묘한 차이로 인해 소리가 어떻게 달라지는지 잘 못 느끼는 분들도 많으실 테고, 아직 본인이 추구하는 소리를 찾아가는 과정에 있는 전공생들 역시 크게 공감하지 못하는 요소들도 있을 거라 생각합니다. 하지만 세계적인 실력을 갖춘 색소폰 아티스트들이 본인들이 추구하는 사운드를 만들기 위한 고민 속에는 분명 본인에게 맞는 악기를 찾는 노력도 많았을 것입니다. 초보자에게는 그에 필요한 부분을 고려한 악기, 그리고 프로 연주자에게는 원하는 사운드를 좀 더 자유롭게 표현할 수 있는 악기가 되도록 악기 제조사들이 연주자들과 함께 고민하고 노력하는 모습을 알 수 있었던 시간이었습니다. 끝으로 이번 이스트만 본사 방문을 위해 힘써주신 이스트만 한국 총판 파가니니 악기사의 홍지호 과장님, 바쁘신 일정에도 불구하고 시간을 내어주신 라이언 리치맨 부사장님, 그리고 방문 전체 일정 조율을 위해 수고해주신 관악기 부서의 메간 돌체 매니저님께 다시 한번 감사드리며, 색소폰을 연주하시는 그리고 새로 악기를 구입하셔야 하는 분들에게 많은 도움이 되셨기를 바랍니다. 감사합니다.